Thanks, Stacy. That set up my presentation really well, so I appreciate that. So I'm Carrie Conaway. I'm the Chief Strategy and Research Officer for the Department of Ed. And I just want to talk a little bit about our school climate survey that we piloted last year, why we did it and what we learned from it. Some of you may know that we've been doing a survey as part of MCAS for the last 15 years at least in 8th and 10th grades. It was after the final session of the test, we would administer a survey, and we would ask often questions like, what are your aspirations after high school? Sometimes we used to ask what types of math courses you were taking before we had a state data collection that would let us know that. But we had never asked questions along the lines of school climate. What we heard, though, from our stakeholders is that we were paying too much attention only to academics, graduation rates, and we needed to pay more attention to the social emotional experience of kids in schools. And so we thought we could use the survey that we already had as a way to get at that as an initial sort of pilot and attempt to sort of learn more about that. So we did this, as Cliff mentioned, to support our social emotional learning health and safety strategy. Helps expand statewide systematic data about this dimension of kids' experience in schools. Also, for the districts that participate, they get a Massachusetts-specific comparison point, whereas other surveys, if they're more national in scope, you might not know what it looks like in Massachusetts. Also, some of you may remember that a few years ago, the legislature passed a bullying law that had a survey requirement as part of it. And so this also partially meets all the requirements that the legislature had put in for us. So, who participated? I want to start by saying this was optional at all levels, districts, schools, and kids. Districts didn't have to do it, even if their district said the school didn't have to, and kids could individually opt out. Even with that, we did reach grades 5, 8, and 10, and we had a 69% response rate overall, which was great. And the students who responded generally looked pretty representative of the state. The one exception is we had slightly fewer English language learners responding. But other than that, pretty representative of the state as a whole. In terms of what's on the survey, we used the framework that you mentioned, Stacy, the U.S. Department of Ed School Climate Survey. We adapted it and shortened it. The full survey is much longer than what we had space for on the test, and so we made it much shorter, but we did stick with those same 3 dimensions that Stacy talked about. Just to give you an idea of what the types of questions look like, under engagement, things like, my teachers care about me as a person. Students at my school get along well with one another. Under safety, I feel safe at our school. At our school, students learn to care about each other's feelings. And for environment, my teachers are proud of me when I work hard in school. Students help each other learn without having to be asked by the teacher. For each question, students could respond, always true, mostly untrue, or never true. And across these grades, the 3 grades that participated, we piloted 71 different items. So not every kid is responding to every question. We have 7 to 9 common items that appear on all the surveys. And then the others, we were testing out different items, and that's in part because this was a pilot. And we wanted to have a chance to try a lot of different dimensions, make sure we were getting the full range of the very weakest climates to the very strongest, and be able to differentiate those. And also just see how kids responded when they answered the questions, whether the items worked well or not. So how do we report the data? This was, although we've been doing these surveys for years, we had never actually reported data back to the schools about how their kids responded. So this is the first time we've done that. We provided aggregate reports. So no school is getting back any data about how individual kids responded. They are only getting a summary, and only if they had enough kids respond and if the reliability was high enough. In the end, we had 89% of districts and 56% of schools got responses back. What they got was, for every item, they got how kids responded, what percent and number were always true, mostly true, and so forth. We also created an index, and this is because we have a sneaky weapon, which is Sheila Peoples, who's here today. We are very fortunate to have a psychometrician on the team who actually knows how to do proper survey design. So she was able not just to put together a bunch of questions for us, but also create an index that allows us to make fair comparisons across the grades, across the dimension, and over time, ultimately, once we have more than 1 year. Which is really important because otherwise, if you imagine, like, let's say your 5th grade had an index score of 50 this year, and then next year it's 55, is it because the climate got better or because something about the kids changed? And so having that index will allow us to make a fair comparison and not have to worry about whether the kids taking the survey were different in some way. We also provided some interpretive guides. You actually have on your chairs, we have a school climate summary that sort of gives you an idea of what school climate looked like in our strongest schools and our weakest schools. There was also a 2-page summary. We had an annotated report, so we actually took a report and then drew little arrows. This is how you interpret this number, how you interpret that number. So what did we learn, most importantly? The good news is that, in general, kids reported pretty positive findings. There was certainly variation around that, but in general, kids were pretty positive. Probably the most striking positive dimension was their relationships with their teachers. And this gives you a sense of some of the types of items we asked about that and how kids responded. You can see here, this gives you an idea of how the survey works. Not every kid is responding to every question, right? But you can see in 5th grade, it's like 95% of kids think their teachers care about them as a person. It's generally, with respect to teachers, less than 10% of kids are saying mostly or always untrue. Student-to-student relationships were also mainly positive, maybe a little less than the student-to-teacher, but still quite positive. Here's an example of a question we asked in all 3 grades, so you can see what that looks like, and we can compare across. So you can see kids are, even across grades, fairly similar, although the 8th graders in this case are a little lower responding than the 5th or the 10th. Bullying was a big interest because of the state law and because of just our concern about kids having experiences with bullying. We asked a bunch of different questions about this, and depending on how you asked it, you got anywhere between 3 and 12% reporting personally experiencing bullying in the last 30 days, which we would all like that to be lower, but that's not a terribly high rate to begin with. And it also is pretty consistent with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is a national survey the state takes part in. We get a pretty similar answer on there as well. And here's another example of a question we asked on all the grades. If I tell a teacher that someone's being bullied, that the adult will do something to help, and we do get pretty strong responses there. So kids are generally reporting that their teachers, the other adults in the building, are responsive when they see those kind of behaviors. As I mentioned, this index idea is really critical to allow us to make fair comparisons. So this is summarizing the data for the index. The index we've set to average 50 with a standard deviation of 20. Differences of 3 to 4 points are meaningful at the student level. So here you can see that the 5th graders are generally the most positive. They've got the highest average index score. 8th and 10th graders are more similar to one another. The differences seem to be being driven mainly by the engagement area, where the environment area, where the grade 5 is much higher than the other 2, and also safety, where grade 5 is a little higher. Engagement looks pretty similar across all the grades. In terms of areas for improvement, grade 5 was the weakest on engagement. That's probably where I would focus if I were in the 5th grade. Grade 8 was the lowest overall. Again, not super negative, but the lowest. And so in middle school, there's a lot of room for folks to improve. Grade 10, safety was the biggest concern. Even schools with the weakest climates, though, still have a lot of strengths. Most report that adults are addressing safety issues. There's support systems in place. Adults helping support individual kids' academic success. But they could work more in general on teachers helping students socially and emotionally versus academically, and students feeling comfortable asking for help. And then to get the strongest climate, to reach the strongest climate, the biggest difference were around fairness and consistency of school rules and student autonomy. That was what really differentiated the average from the top. And also, I would think of it as sort of a good to great scenario where moving from mostly true to always true on any individual item. Cliff has already mentioned a few of these. We have a number of resources to help schools improve in this area. It wouldn't be very helpful if we just administered a survey and measured their climate without offering something to help. And I'm happy to have Cliff and Rochelle answer questions about those. Our next steps, first of all, we're going to issue a technical report that will give a full summary of findings. What we've issued right now is really just a 2-page summary. That'll be coming in early 2018. For next year's administration, we view it as really an improvement pilot where we're trying to improve our indices, get stronger on the items, improve the index, We'd really like to add a district-level bullying index. We had hoped to do it this year, and just the data didn't support it, so we're trying to build towards that. We're going to repeat in the same grades. We're going to look at whether there are other ways to administer it. I think we'd be the first to say that administering it right after the MCAS might not be the best time to do that. On the other hand, the marginal cost is zero. We were already doing the survey. So we're going to look into what it would take to do it differently and whether that's feasible for us. And we christened it with a new name. We're going to call it Vocal Views of Climate and Learning. So thank you all.